what I'm going to talk about is what I think of as a kind of new balance that's being achieved, or a new relationship, really, between violence and nonviolence, especially in the revolution. All of this began for me when I became a reporter in the Vietnam War back in 1965 and 1966 and 7, rather. And I want to suggest that war is always a shock for those experiencing it the first time. I think it's a tremendous trauma, psychological, of course, physical. And certainly it was a seminal shock for me, and it was one that sort of set me on the path that I've been on ever since. But I think that in Vietnam there was another shock that was particular to that war, maybe not particular to it, but certainly characterized it, which I think added to the sense of shock. And I think it's something that not only reporters but also veterans felt. And that was that the war didn't make sense in its own terms. We see the Arab uprising this year, and it's not especially anti-imperial, it's against domestic tyrants. So it seems that that long wave has life in it still, which is something that surprises me and amazes me and inspires me and thrills me. Second question that I just put out there is, what about the apparent enervation of popular will in established democracies, such as our own? Are we losing the Tocquevillian arts of voluntary association? Are we just overrun by money and television? Well, it looks very much that way, but once again, I take hope from something that is really embryonic, but that's the Wisconsin demonstrations and this sort of new wave of a new spirit there, certainly, and how far that will go is anybody's guess. So the shape of the problem here, I think, dictates the shape of the solution, and it has to be some form of what I call cooperative power. It's a humble phrase. And so my vision, just to wind up with this, is hardly that government governs best, which governs least. It's a strong public movements, of course nonviolent, backing strong states that then share their abundant power to create strong international institutions that have the mandate and the means at all levels to protect jeopardized terrestrial life, but remain strong enough at the base to resist abuse of power at the top.
You talk about the triumph of inferior violence. And I can't imagine any moral advocate of nonviolence saying, well, it's inferior violence that we're really looking for. We might be outgunned by those. We're going to shoot like hell. They might kill more, but nonetheless, combined with our political will and the fact that we represent the people and they don't, we're going to win. I mean, that's okay as a strategy that you're outgunned, but you use as a compensation the moral force of your, if you like, democratic or public authority or anti-imperial authority. But I don't really see that inferior violence is a form of nonviolence. It's simply a form of the weakness of violence. Nonviolence, in the same breath as you talk about inferior violence or compensatory features of other things that allow you to win, despite the fact that you are not armed as heavily as you'd like to be, just strikes me. I get confused then by what you mean by nonviolence. It's one thing to say that a strong democratic politics substitutes for violence and becomes itself a moral way of acting in accord with nonviolence. It's another thing to say, we're outgunned, we can kill as many as we can, but we need other means as well.
It's an effort at understanding. So I'm trying to understand how it is that movements that are either completely nonviolent or who wield inferior violence can defeat, the so-called final arbiter of superior force. And why that happens, it seems to be happening on a continuing basis. So what you call the slipperiness of nonviolence, I would prefer the word ambiguity. I think that what has been discovered, beginning with Gandhi, but continuing through these movements, is that acts, what seem at first to be mere acts of conscience, turn out to have political strength.
This is the real question I want to raise. The Arendtian understanding of imperialism involved to some extent nationalism following the flag, the 19th century nation states getting behind these commercial ventures. And even the original Tea Party was the British government collusion with a multinational corporation. These The tea that they dumped was the tea of the East India Corporation, a multinational corporation that was in league with the royal governor of Massachusetts, and it was a collusive thing. The nature of imperial power has changed. We have a global kind of corporate power, which is more diffuse. It is kind of soft power in the Joe Nye sense, which is not the real sense. And the traction points against that are hard to find. And that's what I'm trying to figure out.
The places where the uprisings have been most nonviolent are precisely those where there was a state in operation, places where there's no state.
That's interesting, yeah.
I mean, if you think of the Congo, if you think of Somalia, the death tolls goes way beyond Vietnam. I mean, if you think of Congo, you're talking anywhere between 3 to 6 million people. And it's interesting that, to my mind, that we don't think about this. The extent to which violence is employed in the pre-revolutionary period, to some degree, now, there are exceptions. I mean, and Gandhi actually is an exception. But the extent to which you employ violence in the pre-revolutionary period is the extent to which it carries over in the post-revolutionary period. For example, Algeria. So I would bring that up as a point. As an explanatory device, to me, I would not look to Ireland there were 3,000 strikes in 5 years, protests in Egypt, led labor unions. There were about 1,000 in Tunisia, led by labor unions. In each case, you had uprisings in cities that spilled outward. In each case, you had unions and nascent parties interacting. The fit to what she was talking about, and of course the stuff you're talking about, is unbelievable. More unbelievable is that this literally doesn't come out.
The Gaddafi originally was the Nasser-like nationalist who tried to overcome tribes in 1969 and created a United States. And of course it failed, and once it failed, he allowed the tribes to come back in. And today it is a binational, not a multinational. You've really got the old Serenade in the east, you've got Totalitarian in the west, and those people are coalescing. And as you said, there's a kind of popular will, even around a despot in Tripoli versus, and that is exactly civil war, and that is quite violent on both. Exactly. So I think that's a very incisive point that civil wars by definition can't, because the popular will split.
Non-violence is political action. The motivations of the individuals for engaging in non-violence may be moral, theological, aesthetic, but non-violence of the kind that was being talked about here by Jared, but is by definition, it becomes political. I mean, one could even make the argument that the early Christians were also political. They were political theological. They were resisting worldly power. So I would really, sort of say that I'm with Jonathan. When one talks about violence, one can't just have the feeling of kumbaya, right? I mean, I've been reading a little bit about Gandhi. He's come back in a major way, and not just in the book review section. But this principle of satyagraha involved an enormous amount of self-discipline, because the normal human instinct is to run for your life. Right. I mean, we all would duck, right? But how do you learn self-control, discipline? How do you overcome this most fundamental, human thing, which is the fear of death? So I believe this is what's going to happen in Syria. The more people are going to go out and be killed, the more that moment of conscience in the army is going to kick. And it's going to kick in other parts of the population. And Islam has a tradition of shahada, which means you both bear witness to God and you sacrifice yourself or something. So Friday after mosque, they're going to just put themselves in front of the guns. This is to some extent less than what happened in Tunis. To some extent, it did happen in Egypt. So, non-violence also involves sacrifice, and that is the key, right?
But how would you apply the dual power concept?
In some basic way, you still have the shell of political power. But actual power is moving into the streets, into civil society, into these self-determined organizations
and some idea that the society can establish itself in such a way as to establish a check on power, which is a little different from the division and separation of powers under the Constitution, which is governmental power checking itself. And in Egypt, for example, they seem to have something like that to a certain extent. They handed it over to the military, but they remained constituted. And for instance, when they appointed that miserable prime minister, the people in Tahrir Square said, no, we don't want that guy, and they threw him out.
The only thing I meant to say there is that, not in terms of vis-a-vis Israel, because then you don't have a state over its own people, you have two conflicting societies. But Hezbollah with Lebanon, you know, they have almost at various times taken over Lebanon.
Yeah.
And they've done it with soft power as well as with coercive power, and they're coming from a kind of theological basis, and yet it's kind of a perversion of everything.
What is it? You know, you said what? Is it?
Right, well, that's right. Okay, let me pose it as a question.
Well, if we're looking, I mean, I'm tending to look at on all this with hope and seeing it as positive. But I'll tell you what really gave me pause was reading about the rise of the Nazis to power.
Oh, yes.
Because they developed quite a bit of soft power and civil power, and it wasn't all violence, although they were ready enough to commit violence too.
I was trying to put together the recipe for cooperative power. And so I used the construct of Congress, because we've got, at first I thought maybe cooperative power equaled the Tea Party on its own, but that's not possible, because it's part of, the Tea Party members of Congress are part of a bigger whole. So then I started looking at what is the element that is going to create some sort of cooperative power, and that implies consensus, right? Because we certainly don't have that yet. They may not even have a budget ready for the government. And then I started looking at what are the elements that are going to make this work. Is it going to be the outside powers, as you suggested? We're going to be waiting until we have legislative a turnover because people will vote them out of power because they're angry, or is it going to be internal because you have such powerful leadership somewhere on the in-between that can forge a consensus among these people? So that was my sense of what is exactly cooperative power. And then I moved a little bit outside that to say we had cooperative power with Gandhi, big fan of Gandhi. And something in this writing really struck me when it talked about how cooperative power between someone like Gandhi and Hitler could never have existed. And I understand Hitler was crazy, but nevertheless, what is it about cooperative power in Gandhi here and Hitler here that we've never been able to create some sort of consensus? Were there any internal or external forces that could have created some sort of consensus?
You know, I think a real mystery, I suppose it's a mystery of all revolution, is how that essential commonality of conceptual, linguistic, of goals arises. It just seems to suddenly spring up, you know? For instance, I just couldn't help noticing that not just in Egypt, but really throughout the Middle East, there was a language of dignity, of talking about we want our freedom, we want our human dignity. There was as if somebody had passed out some pamphlets to all of the countries, and they were speaking this way, and how that happens, I don't know.
One of the pamphlets people were reading was by Gene Sharp.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
And I was astonished to see Gene Sharp on the front page of the New York Times.
That was amazing.
And I'm sure he was astonished to see himself on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah.
You know, this is the kind of thing, you know, you read at lefty colleges like Hampshire in the 1980s, Gene Sharp's work. And that brings me to the thought that what has been so amazing is the failure of traditional political scientists, international relations theorists, to understand or appreciate cooperative power and nonviolence. Didn't see it coming in the fall of the Soviet Union.
Ever.
And didn't mean George Soros did more to kind of actively foster that and believe in that than the United States government, which is, maybe that's an exaggeration, but, you know, with Voice of America and everything, but and then, you know, sort of, once again, here we are in shock. Oh, you know, how surprising that this sort of thing would happen. Well, it's, you know, only 20 years later, and what happens in such states kind of remains a black box to a lot of political scientists. And so if you really do have faith in cooperative power and nonviolence, how does that affect policy?
I think maybe we should work a little after this. Jonathan, this is a tremendously exciting and good discussion in which you bring political theory and Aaron back into a live discussion of the history of revolution and its role in nonviolence. So it really helps us illuminate where we are today. So thank you very much for this. Thank you all for coming, and let's give a round of applause. And please join us